Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning as we launch Equity and Innovation Cities, the Case of Cambridge, a report on the state of equity in our innovation city. As Cambridge's Community Foundation focused on shared prosperity, social equity, and cultural richness, we look forward to working with you and those not in the room today here on a shared civic agenda to strengthen our city, retain its goodness and its power. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui. I cannot think of a better person to launch us on this path than our mayor, who gets both the power of the innovation economy as well as the force of the community as on issues of equity and justice. Mayor Siddiqui immigrated to the United States from Karachi at the age of 2 and was raised in Cambridge public housing. She attended Cambridge Ringe and Latin School, graduating with a real passion for local activism and service, which motivated her to co-found the Cambridge Youth Council, now in its 18th year. And it's quite a force if you don't know about it. Mayor Siddiqui has a bachelor's degree in public policy from Brown University and a JD from Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law, and has practiced as a legal aid attorney in the communities of Lawrence, Lynn, and Lowell, which speaks a lot for her commitment to issues of social justice. Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui is currently serving her first term as mayor of Cambridge and chair of the Cambridge School Committee, and second term on the Cambridge City Council. Welcome, Mayor Siddiqui.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you this morning. We're also joined on the Zoom by Vice Mayor Mallon, Councillor Nolan, Councillor Sabrina Wheeler, and State Rep Owens. I'm really pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Cambridge Community Foundation to today's discussion on the innovation economy in Cambridge and how our residents are doing as we near the end of the COVID-19 pandemic and recover. Cambridge Community Foundation's new report, Equity in Innovation Cities, the Case of Cambridge, reveals that we've emerged as a leader among the nation's innovation cities. With this title, though, comes responsibility. Innovation is so valuable and is key for our economy's immense growth. But at the same time, we must ensure that this growth and innovation does not further deepen the inequities that exist in Cambridge. We take this responsibility very seriously and have already begun the work across sectors to address the injustices the Equity and Innovation Report brings to light. One of the ways we are seeking to address these inequities is through a new initiative that I'm excited to reveal in the coming weeks. I would love to say more, but you'll need to stay tuned in for our grand reveal soon. As the city continues to grow, we can and must preserve what makes Cambridge special: the arts, locally owned businesses, and the diversity of people and ideas that have attracted people here for generations. We can and must give every resident a shot at the many opportunities Cambridge offers. I know this is possible because I am witness to the many efforts that lead to real results every single day. I see how our nonprofit organizations step up for our residents with critical services and opportunities. I've seen how local businesses, universities, and schools have come together to find ways to support our families and children. I've seen residents and the philanthropic community rise together to lead a helping hand. And as a city leader, I've seen how other city leaders and staff are working to ensure residents are safe, supported, and connected. I'm confident that after today's discussion, these sectors will continue to build on their collective power to be even more innovative on addressing our city's most pressing issues. Creativity and innovation are what makes Cambridge, Cambridge. By putting our minds together, our various levels of expertise and experiences will contribute to a better Cambridge for all its residents to thrive. I'm so grateful to the Cambridge Community Foundation for publishing this in-depth report and for providing a path toward a collective dialogue that leads to action. I'd now like to turn it over back to my friend, colleague, and president of the Cambridge Community Foundation, Geeta Pradhan, who will walk us through the findings of the report. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mayor Siddiqui. We are delighted to partner with you and with the administration to understand our city and join with all stakeholders, as you mentioned, to ensure its inclusivity, its vibrancy, and its amazing charm. We launched work on this report based on pre-pandemic observations that Cambridge, a growing innovation hub, was seeing levels of gentrification, housing stress, and growing racial and income disparities like cities like San Francisco, which according to some was losing its soul. Our greatest concerns were linked to rapid gentrification that was making the city unaffordable to many and pushing out the very diversity and vitality of Cambridge that we all love. We set out to look at Cambridge in comparison with other innovation cities to understand and ensure that we are able to protect, change, grow, or nurture what we value about our city. And then the pandemic hit. Though it will take some time to capture the true effects of the pandemic, early data and anecdotal information from our emergency funds reinforce that those who were hurting in the boom would also be the ones hit hardest when things weren't going so well. With that issue of equity and justice in mind, this report examines the effect of an innovation city's success on its residents by taking a broader and deeper look at data across all income sectors. And what we found as we looked at this report was that Cambridge is a leader among several innovation cities, built over a dynamic decade marked by innovation and growth. However, Cambridge's resulting prosperity was not being shared equally, and disparities across race and income grew and have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Which brings us to the question today: how can we come together to develop an inspired, inclusive, and civic agenda for the city we all love? Cambridge, where innovation thrives and new ideas are nurtured and championed, is truly an innovation city, is leading innovation city. Our impact and our challenges are often obscured when included in metro level data and indicators. But when we drill down and look at the primary cities of the Brookings Institution's superstar metros with mature innovation economies like San Francisco and Seattle, and those emerging like Nashville and Pittsburgh, we see that Cambridge leads the pack with the greatest share of adult residents employed in the innovation occupations by a strong margin, almost 7% higher than Seattle, San Jose, Arlington, Virginia, and about 10% higher than San Francisco. The new Cambridge is thriving in the innovation economy. We rank at or near the top on almost all metrics of competitive advantage in a global innovation economy. We are number one in employment, as you just saw. We are number one, mostly highly educated population with more PhDs than any other city by a tremendous margin. Number two in growth of young knowledge workers. 3 of the nation's top 20 zip codes with the most venture capital are in Cambridge. We are the 4th highest and had the fastest growth in household median income. The leading innovation city that we see today is a result of a decade of growth. And today, this innovation cluster has grown to rival, if not outsize, the traditional core of Cambridge's economy, which is higher education, but is in fact fueled by our universities and research centers. The last decade saw an explosion in Cambridge, not just of the economy, innovation economy, which grew jobs by 80%, but also growth in total businesses and jobs, which now outnumber residents. Cambridge's population grew to more than 118,000, the largest since 1950. And growth in prosperity with the median household income of 28% outpaced statewide growth for the first time. The result was that we are an immensely resource-rich community where 1 in 5 people earn more than $200,000 a year for a combined annual earnings of about $5 billion, an economy that generated $18 billion in wages, and property that is valued at $32 billion as the city attracts more people. But the new Cambridge is a story of juxtapositions and intertwining of success and shortfall, wealth and poverty, dynamism, and dispossession. Along with the innovation abundance, Cambridge has the 7th largest gap in incomes between the top and bottom households, more than 300,000, and leads in cities in housing costs, ranking 3rd in home values behind only the Bay Area, and number 1 with the highest average monthly rental costs. During this dynamic decade, Cambridge actually lost families with children and now has the smallest child population of all the 25 innovation cities. And Cambridge, like other innovation cities, became more diverse over the last decade with double-digit growth among Latinx, Asian, and multiracial residents, but with deep disparities in income. While the bottom 20% of households earn just 2.5% of all income in Cambridge, the top 20% of households earn more than 50% of the income. And despite the fact that the average household in Cambridge now earns almost 6 figures, the average Black households earns just a third of that, at a slightly little more than 33,000 annually. And it saw an almost negligible increase relative to 2010, despite dynamic citywide growth. To understand these inequities, we decided to look at the population in quintiles or even 20% shares of households. This allowed us to identify with greater nuance how the changes happening in Cambridge have played out on a more fine-grained level, from the bottom to the middle and to the top rung of the economic ladder. Let's spend a few moments taking in the profiles of who makes up these quintiles. The first quintile, population, is most ethnically diverse, 30% Black, with average household incomes of 13,000. Most single-parent household, highly cost-burdened, but long-term residents. They work mostly in the service sector, which was actually hit hardest by the pandemic. The loss of jobs in the service sector was quite astounding. The second quintile has the largest share of immigrants. Average household incomes of about 50,000. They're recent movers with the greatest increase in education credentialing, employed largely in education in the nonprofit sector. The profile of this quintile has changed very little over the past decade. The third or middle quintile is the new Cambridge, with average incomes of about 95,000. Increasingly diverse, 40% millennials, only 10% of the households have children. The middle quintile saw a loss of Black households from 9% down to 6% in 2018. The population in this quintile is highly mobile, with almost half who have not lived at the same address for more than 2 years. They are a growing share of the innovation economy. The fourth quintile looks pretty similar to a decade ago. Predominantly white, well-educated, mid-career professionals with incomes ranging 151,000. People in this quintile are largely double-income households with no kids, 60% renters, and mostly able to afford housing. This fairly stable population is employed largely in the innovation sector. The top quintile, the fifth quintile, households earn on average 343,000 annually. They are two-parent households with children, majority homeowners. They're working in top-tier professions such as management, finance, and legal occupations. When stacked against each other, these quintiles highlight 3 glaring facts. A third of our seniors are poor. Children are polarized at the top and the bottom. And the traditional middle class made up of family households has been replaced by a growing millennial population. Comparisons across quintiles also reveal stark racial inequities. 80% of residents in the top quintile are white. 40% of all Black residents now live in the bottom quintile. Asian residents have made the largest gains in the top and middle quintiles, and Latinx residents have made the largest gain in the middle and the bottom quintiles. Housing affordability has been a growing concern for the first, second, and some in the third quintile. while 56% of renters and 67% of owners in the lowest income households spend more than 50% of their income on housing. Disparities in educational outcomes continue to deepen the opportunity gap. Just 45% of adults in the lowest income quintile have a bachelor's degree or higher, meaning that more than half lack the educational credentials necessary for success in our knowledge-based economy. Affecting access to the innovation economy, and in a city where 22% of adults are employed in the innovation sector, just 8% of adults in the bottom tier have broken into this growing sector. Notably, this is a slight decrease in innovation employment from a decade ago for this quintile, while every other quintile saw gains in innovation employment, especially the middle and the fourth quintile. With 70% of Black residents in the bottom two quintile, the deepest income divide in Cambridge is between Black and white residents. These disparities compelled us to take a deeper look into racial equity and justice, particularly since Cambridge has long celebrated its diversity and the rich history of its Black and African American communities. At the turn of the 20th century, Black Canterburyans were part of an emerging middle class, and in the 70s and the 80s, there were high rates of homeownership among Black families. The data in this report, however, presents stark disparities for the Black community in present-day Cambridge. Disparities start early and persist through life, starting in third grade and throughout high school, as reflected in the third grade reading and advanced placement participation, suggesting that we are not providing our young children of color, particularly our Black children, who comprise 1 in 4 children in the Cambridge public schools, with the strong on-ramps to join the innovation economy, resulting in lower education credentials, which limit choices and determine access to the innovation economy and other opportunities, eventually resulting in serious racial equity gaps. If things were tough for low-income residents and our Black and brown communities before the pandemic, COVID only made it worse. Like communities across the country, COVID disproportionately impacted Cambridge residents of color, making up just about 40% of the population, but more than 60% of all cases. Job losses mounted, unemployment skyrocketed, along with the need for food assistance. Today, 1 in 8 Cambridge residents is food insecure. Also, as school and work move to a virtual environment like the Zoom we are on today, it is important to note that 11% of Black and Latinx households lack an internet connection in a city that is home to some of the largest tech companies in the world. These data reinforce what we heard from 20 deep interviews and conversations with others across a broad spectrum of people from across the city. We heard the regrets and nostalgia over loss of the city's long-term diversity and its impact on a sense of community, and the charm and quirkiness made possible by the arts community that Cambridge has been steadily losing. But we also heard their deep love for Cambridge and their belief that Cambridge is a city of possibilities where anything is possible if we put our heads together. A city whose size, resources, and intellectual capacity offer an opportunity and a vision and a direction summed up in this quote. It mirrors a persistent refrain that we heard from so many, to take this moment of crisis and seek within it opportunity. As we look at the next 10 years, then, how can we harness the power of our innovation economy and prioritize equitable growth? Thank you. I'm delighted to now introduce Adrian Walker, Boston Globe columnist and our moderator for today's panel discussion featuring some exceptional local experts. Adrian is a native of Miami, where he wrote for the Miami News. Since his arrival at the Boston Globe in 1998, He served as City Hall bureau chief, State House reporter, deputy political editor, and is now Metro columnist. In this role, he has written many important pieces on urban issues. He is also a member of the Globe Spotlight team that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting in 2018 on the series Boston Race, Image, Reality. Adrian, I now turn the program over to you. Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Geeta. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to the Foundation for this great report and your outstanding work. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, the panelists who are joining us today to talk about Cambridge and where we go from here. First of all, Andy Orr is Vice President and General Manager of Juniper Networks. Andy joined Juniper through the acquisition of 128 Technology, which he co-founded in 2014 and served as its Chief Executive Officer for 6+ years. He also co-founded Acme Packets Incorporated in August 2000 and served as its President and CEO for 13 years. He is a trustee at Concord Academy and also the chairman of the American Repertory Theater in Cambridge, which, as you all know, is a joint partnership with Harvard University. Eboney Hearn is the executive director of MIT's Office of Engineering Outreach Programs. Since 2016, she has overseen the strategic implementation of programs that create access for middle and high school students from underrepresented and underserved backgrounds in science and engineering fields. Eboney helps students to identify their talents and realize their potential. She's passionate about delivering programs that demystify both the college application process and what it takes to pursue a career in STEM. Prior to leading OEOP, Eboney served as Assistant Dean for Graduate Education, Diversity Initiatives in the MIT Office of Graduate Education from 2014 to 2016. Earlier, she was Program Director of Diversity Initiatives at the Broad Institute from 2008 to 2014. In both roles, she provided strategic direction, insight, and coordination to increase student diversity and academic success at all academic levels. David Williams serves as the Director of Policy Outreach at Opportunity Insights, a research and public policy lab based at Harvard University, dedicated to using big data to improve upward mobility in America. He is tasked with supporting research and evidence-based policy change by creating and leading partnerships with communities across the country. Current projects include Creating Moves to Opportunity, a national housing mobility initiative, and the Charlotte Opportunity Initiative, a community-wide place-based initiative aimed at improving economic opportunity throughout Charlotte and Mecklenburg County down in North Carolina. And last but not least at all, Tony Clark is president of My Brother's Keeper Cambridge Task Force. He's a graduate of Cambridge Public Schools. Over the course of his career, he has held posts at New York University, City University of New York, Columbia University, and Johns Hopkins University. Tony has also worked for the U.S. Department of Education, taught for 10 years in the New York City public school system, and served as an executive for several leading education reform agencies, which included supporting the work in the New York City Department of Education. He is a social critic who has written and published articles that have examined race, culture, and education that have ranged from sharing his experience while serving as a consultant to the Ferguson, Missouri School District after the death of Michael Brown, to mapping out strategies to help teachers talk about Trayvon Martin in their classrooms. I'd like to thank this great panel and with its diverse areas of expertise. And I want to kick things off with just one broad question. I mean, I think we all know that inequality is a huge issue in cities like Cambridge, but tell me, if you would, what struck you most as you heard the findings in the report? Andy, we'll start with you.
Sure. I suppose your strength becomes your weakness as a place becomes rife with more capital, more high-paying jobs. You start to actually squeeze out the folks that are the lifeblood of the community that need to be brought along, that need to participate. It's funny, innovation benefits from inclusivity, but it requires intentionality on behalf of the corporations that are really creating and are the engines of this value. And to see the home prices go up was highly problematic. Also to see who's raising kids and who isn't, that also was highly problematic to me.
David, you spend your life immersed in data. What did you make of this?
No, I think that's right, and I think it's consistent with a lot of what we see in our research and data as well. I was kind of in a conversation around housing policy in the Bay Area and dealing with those exact same issues, right? I think, inequality is a very real thing, and I think a lot of our research focuses on the impact that a place has on the kids who grow up there, especially those kids who grow up in low-income families. And something we see in Cambridge, right? There is that disparity between kids who grow up in high and low-income families, but Cambridge really is a place where we see relatively good results for those kids growing up locally in low-income families. But I think, as Andy mentioned, right, you see this pressure where that success begets these other issues, right? And I think, kids can't take advantage of what Cambridge provides if their families can't afford to live in Cambridge and that they have those housing opportunities, right? So I think there's a real opportunity. There's so many resources in Cambridge in terms of human capital, in terms of financial resources, but how do we really make sure that kids are able to benefit from all the opportunity that exists around them? I think that's a key issue that we deal with, and I think the data reflects how difficult it can be when you, again, have that opportunity, but you also face those pressures because of those really good things happening in the community.
Certainly. Ebony, what struck you about this report?
Great question. I think Andy and David have highlighted probably much of what I would have also shared as some of my observations from the report, and just thinking and reflecting on what I have learned as an education practitioner, to think about how we evaluate the initiatives that are already existing in our communities to ensure that they are having the success that we wish for them to have. I know that there's a lot of resources expended in Cambridge between higher education institutions, corporations, and both locally, regionally, and nationally around broadening participation in the STEM and innovation economies. And so I think there's a lot of great work happening, and I think this begins to highlight the opportunities, and also requires us to dig a little bit deeper into understanding the complete career pathway for individuals who pursue careers in STEM and innovation, and understand why people commit to these careers and why people leave, and how can we use this information and this data to design initiatives and programs that will actually impact change and lead to lasting change for our young people, that invite them into this economy. And I'm happy to talk about additional ideas about how to do that as we move the conversation along. Great.
Tony Clark, you grew up here, and you spend your time on the ground. What surprised you about this, if anything?
Great question. One of the things, reading the report, which is actually a great report, particularly in the income inequality section, it referenced what we all know and what we heard in Geeta's phenomenal presentation, that poverty and prosperity are separated by blocks. In preparing for this conversation, I recently learned that there are over 360 publicly traded companies in the state of Massachusetts, with over 60 being in Cambridge. That means billions, if not trillions of dollars, are funneled through these particular communities. I grew up in the Port, which is a stone throw away from Kendall Square, where a lot of this innovation, if you may, is taking place. So to have that opportunity kind of dangled in your face, but not having access to that, it's quite frustrating. And I think that the report highlights and illuminates the fact that while there's a great deal of prosperity, the access points aren't as succinct as one may think. So this is I think the report speaks to a number of things, and I look forward to having more of a conversation of that. And I also look forward to, in the report, kind of pushing on our city officials to think a little bit more strategically. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but our neighbor across the river or across the bridge, in I think it was a New York Times article late March, looked at the fact that the Walsh administration had about $2.1 billion in consulting contracts, with less than 1% going to Black folks. So I think as we have this conversation and we talk about equity and access, we also need to kind of push on ourselves around how are we funneling the talent that we say that we want to highlight that looks like myself. So just want to acknowledge that.
That's great. Hey, Andy, I want to come back to you for a second, because you're a person who's participated in the innovation economy in Cambridge for years. What role can companies play in harnessing the power of the innovation economy to sort of level the playing field and to begin to address these issues?
I think an unbelievable role. I went to school in Cambridge, and I chose not to go the traditional route. I was always interested in business. And back in the late 80s, when I graduated, a lot of folks from Harvard went and became investment bankers. And I'd want to do that. I wanted to find a startup company. I found a company in Kendall Square in December of '88. I walked into that company. They paid me $23,500. It didn't care where I went to college. I was an entry-level kid, and they gave me a chance. And over the next 18 months, I worked really hard, and it made such a difference. That intake is what formed my ability, that access, and companies can do that. They can provide opportunities to folks, they can train folks, and they can really create the next generation of innovators and stars. And so I think companies play an enormous role. And if you're able to partner with them, and you have to be careful, the large public corporations are going to think about this problem differently. They're going to think about it from a public relations point of view, and maybe even a social responsibility point of view. And there's a lot of policy associated with that, and that's great. But it's the little startup companies that move really quick, that run the risk of taking people that have really great attitude and aptitude and maybe nothing beyond that and invest in them. And I think that's where you're going to see the quickest bang for your buck in terms of providing access and inclusivity. I think companies can play a very, very large role, and they should.
David Williams, at the level of cities, I mean, what can cities do to begin to address this kind of inequity, especially in a city like Cambridge that's so driven by innovation? And are there any cities that are doing this better?
So I think especially on the innovation front is interesting. So we've done some research on, right, the impact of geographies and place on the innovation economy. And something we see is that, like, literally places that have more people who file patents, who create inventions, right, all those young people who grow up in that community are more likely to become inventors themselves. It's interesting though, we see specifically though, for places that have more female inventors, all the young women are more likely to become inventors themselves. And I think that really speaks to the importance of exposure and really seeing what's possible for you. But I think to Tony's point, right, something we also see is that, we can actually see that, by the time you're in third grade, your aptitude for math can really determine, what path you're on, especially in the innovation economy, but only if you come from a high income family, right? So basically lower income families, families of color, children of color, and women specifically, right? They don't see that same trajectory even when they have the aptitude for these different fields, especially invention and innovation. And I think to what Andy's speaking about, I think kind of partnering the public and private sector can be really powerful, right? We have models like Year Up and Work Advance, right? Specifically focused on, kids who may not be on a traditional path, but really being intentional and linking them with job opportunities makes a big difference, right? The companies benefit from their talent and skill, and these kids end up earning much more, right? These programs, these models really work. And I think, again, both pairing the public sector with the private sector, really creating these on-ramps, I think has shown to be very effective. And in a place like Cambridge that has all these jobs, that has opportunities, right? I think that intentionality is saying that, we're not going to settle for ensuring that all these kids don't have these opportunities when they exist right in their backyard. I think that intentionality and that committing to making sure that everyone has access is really important, because heck, it works. Like, we see models, this can really work, especially in a place that has, such a kind of wealth of opportunity.
Eboney, I'd like you to jump in here. You're a teacher, you're an engineer. That's where you spend your time. How do we begin to address opportunity gaps and to create more opportunities for people who are growing up here in Cambridge?
I think that is also a great question. So when I started working in this space as an educator and thinking about diversity initiatives and what broadens participation in science and engineering, because of my hat as an engineer, I thought it was really important to start by investigating the problem and understanding what are the challenges and what are the opportunities. Talking to folks who have committed to, like I mentioned earlier, those who have committed to the career, those who have left the career, and understanding that, but also understanding what were the important on-ramps in their training and educational experiences. What are some of those successful model programs that you just mentioned and initiatives that exist in other places that can be replicated and made your own? How do institutions and individuals contribute to the issues of the old metaphor of the leaky pipeline? And I think most importantly, I've spent time digging into understanding from the perspective of Black and Brown students, engineers, innovators, educators, researchers and scholars, from their perspective. what do we need to be doing in our programs, initiatives in our schools to elevate and educate Black and Brown students. And so there's a list of folks that we can learn from. I think about folks like Shirley Malcolm and Bob Moses and Sylvia Hurtado, Ebony McGee, Dorinda Carter, Jeff Howard. There are so many phenomenal individuals who have contributed great ideas and a foundation to what we can build on. There's so much there for creating a roadmap for initiatives. And so when I think about the programs that I design at MIT and have designed in other places, there are a couple of critical things to consider as I've come to understand the problem and the contributing factors, whether it's systemic or individual, et cetera. I begin with designing programs that communicate high expectations, a sharp focus on the strengths of our young people, and a belief that they can learn anything that they put their minds and hands to, and that's anything. So, we know that there are some stereotypes and perspectives that exist about the challenges of pursuing careers in STEM and who does that. And we really work hard in our programs at MIT, for example, where we're engaging with kids from Cambridge, Boston, Lawrence, and Worcester, and other cities across the country, like really helping them understand that they have the capacity to learn whatever it is that they're committed to learning. And we engage in what others might call culturally relevant and culturally responsive project-based learning experiences so that students can see themselves as those leading scientists, engineers, innovators, and inventors by investigating problems that matter to them in their communities. And so I have young folks from Boston who are very concerned about rising sea levels in East Boston and what that means for their communities, and coming up with innovative solutions to think about that. I have young folks in Cambridge that talk about, traveling in and around the city, and maybe a bus stop needs to figure out a way to be economically warmed up, and how do we do that? So the students are really creative, they're very curious, and we have to create initiatives that really bolster that. We need to put in front of them individuals who are role models, who believe in our students and communicate that belief in them. I think it's important to create a strong community for them that they feel like they can be empowered by others who look like them and believe in have some of the same aspirations. And then really make sure students understand the full breadth of opportunities that are available to them in their communities here in Cambridge and more broadly. We talk a lot about what does it look like to really meet a high level of success, but then what are all the roadblocks that can come up, and what are the challenges that may come up, and how do you overcome that? How do you overcome things like microaggressions that may happen in the workplace, et cetera? We're having these deep conversations so that they feel quite equipped to be successful at the next level.
That's great. I found myself nodding to a lot of that. Tony, talk to me about Black Cambridge. I mean, all the data about Black Cambridge is really sobering. How are we going to save the community here?
No, that's the Black guy, right?
Well, no, I'm
joking. It was a joke. It was a joke.
I know.
No, but I think the question is actually a really complicated one, because Black Cambridge, and who is Black Cambridge, right? We think about Cambridge, I think about my Eritrean and Ethiopian brothers and sisters. I think about my West Indian brothers and sisters, which includes Jamaican, Haitian, Bayesian. And I think about American-born African Americans. And I think they all are different in their kind of how they have navigated this city, but also in terms of how the city has navigated them, right? In terms of when you're an African American, and you may not have the same institutional understanding of how Cambridge works, whereas maybe some of our Caribbean brothers and sisters who have, folks have migrated here a little earlier, so they have a little bit of understanding of not only how the economics work in this particular city, but also in terms of how the political structures haven't worked. So to go back to your initial question, which is a brilliant one, is that one of the things in which the Black community, in my opinion, needs to kind of really come back to itself and say, who are we? What do we do? What are our goals? What are our expectations, right? What is our agenda? One of the things in which you think about, particularly, and you know this better than myself, Mr. Walker, because you've written about it, is that particularly Boston as itself, as Black community, doesn't really have an identity. And I don't want to use your words, but when I read your work over the years, it's kind of asking us to ask that tough question. And so I think in Cambridge, we have to ask ourselves, who are we? What is our agenda? What are we looking to obtain in this particular agenda? So, for example, when we think about this, this conversation around achievement, oftentimes we are marred in this idea, like, let's take the semantics of what other folks would say. Well, opportunity gap, access gap. We just need to be fundamentally honest, the fact that in terms of Black and brown kids are disproportionately not achieving at the rates as their white counterparts, and have that honest conversation. We need to be intentional and honest about the fact that in terms of our school committee members and other folks will say, we're spending about $30,000 per pupil, but, you know, anecdotes in my community often say, well, you know, student A is getting $59,000 worth of those resources and student B is getting 1,000. You know, what are we looking to do that? I think lastly, in terms of when we think about the corridor, particularly Western Ave, and while it's not as graphic and as inhumane as what happened in Tulsa from May 31st to June 1st, 100 years ago, Black business is gone, right? And so when you don't see Black business, when you don't see yourself represented in that particular way, and when you also couple with the fact that we have, you know, with all due respect to the electeds on the call, we have a weak political structure. So while we may have, you know, we have city council members and stuff of that nature, one may not feel as though I can go to them and get really, they can really move the needle in a way in which a strong mayoral structure would work. And so I think it's incumbent upon Black folks to set an agenda, to think about how they want to work within the confines in which they have been given, to disrupt some systems, to be honest, and to demand things such as, think of the education system. I don't know why we as a city, we're relatively small, as the report had mentioned, we don't have as many young people as we had before. Instead, you know, we often talk about, you know, individualized education plans, and we become marred by those as a negative. But I think we need to look at that model and have an individual excellence plan. Let's give every kid a plan to be excellent in this particular city. And the fact that in terms of, we mentioned innovation a great deal throughout this conversation, is that we need to highlight the beauty and genius of the Black innovation that's going on and fund it, like places like Evanston, some of the work in which they're doing. So I just want to reiterate, I was joking. But I also, I just want to highlight the fact that in terms of Black folk in Cambridge, in my opinion, and this is just coming from Tony Clark and not MBK or anyone else, it's kind of like the King, I have a dream speech. A lot of folks acknowledge the first 3 sentences of that particular speech and just go to I have a dream. In the first stanza, he's really critical about in terms of we are here to cast a check, right? And that check has often had insufficient funds for the Negro. Cambridge has not been good to its Negroes. And I think we need to push on that and ask themselves in terms of live your creed and not just the cosmetic platitude. So we can do better, but I think Black folks need to demand more as well.
That's great. Hey, Andy, I want to go ahead, Andy.
I just wanted to add 2 things, Tony, to what you said. One is people need to see themselves in those around them that are succeeding or it doesn't work. And that was important to me. That was why I was drawn to Kendall Square in '88. There were startup companies and they were done by people that I thought I could be someday. I saw myself in them. So it resonates powerfully what you're saying. And I think capital is critical for those kinds of businesses to start, because the advantage I had is that I could raise a little bit of capital, but if you can't raise any capital, you can't actually begin your innovation journey. And the other thing I just want to bring up, because I don't want it to leave, is that innovation needs a broad diet. And one of the most important vitamins in that diet is arts. And it's not arts for the sake of helping people be more creative. That is true, but I think it's arts because it builds bridges. I'm very limited. Many of us are very limited in our experiences. And the way we have dialogues, the way we understand those around us, and the way we build bridges is through the kind of artistic experience that's shared that allows us to understand our responsibility to ourselves, to our neighbors, and to our community. And Cambridge has a phenomenal art scene. And I think that is a really powerful engine as well that can help provide inclusivity into the innovation economy, which I think is part of what we're looking for.
Okay, but Andy, I have a question for you about the business community. How invested is it in equity, and how much are people prepared to do? Where's the will?
Yeah, well, I mean, talking about the business community like it's a single consciousness is, look, you had to stratify Cambridge into 5 tiers.
We're talking about the media, but I'm talking about the people who run companies in Cambridge.
I am not in touch with the large public corporations that answer to shareholders that probably have plans that I'm not sure to what extent they sit there in their staff meetings on a weekly basis and talk about diversity and inclusivity and what progress they're making. That doesn't mean they don't care. It doesn't mean we should declare war on them. It just means that we have work to do to create awareness, to make this something that's important to them. What's changed in 30 years, when I started, there was no notion of real social responsibility in entrepreneurship. And today there is. And if there's something that I could work to help create resonance and awareness, it would be that of the people that are running those companies. I think that would make a difference and make them better stewards of their local community.
Let's talk about the pandemic and what it's going to mean for Cambridge. Well, I mean, one of the things I think we all know already is that it has exacerbated inequality in all kinds of ways. So how do we begin to counter the effects of what the pandemic is going to do to increase all the things this report is already showing? Ebony, you want to go first?
I'm still thinking on the answer to the question.
Okay.
All right. Give me a
Questions
second.
out there for anybody?
Thanks.
Maybe I
The
can.
pandemic and inequity. What do we do?
I mean, I think the big thing is just one, really acknowledging how, I mean, it's exacerbating things in a very real way, right? We already know about inequality, what was happening beforehand, but right, in terms of employment rates, the crisis hit everyone, but employment rates for higher wage workers are actually back up to almost higher than pre-pandemic levels, whereas in many places down by over 30% for lower wage workers. And I think just kind of to what Tony and Andy were speaking to, I think there's an interesting challenge where I think Cambridge and Boston writ large, I think there is something about the Black community organizing, really demanding more of the community and of resources. But I think also there's something to be said about, how do we really build kind of cross socioeconomic and cross racial relationships? And I'd be curious on Andy and Ebony's perspective as well, because I think there's something about these on-ramps that it's about networks, right? It's about people, it's about what you're accustomed to. And I think, even though, outcomes for Black kids who grew up in Cambridge are relatively good, right? They're still not competing or being able to access these on-ramps in the same way as their white peers. One thing that we see in our research is that, even for Black and white kids who grow up in similarly low-income households, right? Those white kids grow up to earn almost 10,000 more than their Black peers in adulthood. Right, so it's not just an issue of class, but there's real racial dynamics at play. And I think these are really difficult issues to deal with. And I think, again, they're only being even re-emphasized by the pandemic. So kind of doubling down on, how we can, again, create those relationships, create those networks, create those supports, and I think hold ourselves accountable is really important. And I think there's just a lot of kind of tweaks, but also broader systems changes that can, bring real dollars to the table, bring real opportunity, and not just kind of a broader conversation, but really got, making the dollars make sense.
Thank you, David, for jumping in there for me. So I appreciate that. So thanks for the question, Adrian. So it's been a really interesting year for us as we've had to transition, like as all educational systems, right, have had to transition to this virtual space. And I think about the access and lack of access to computers and Wi-Fi and other just technological things that help to make this sort of virtual space work. And I also think and reflect on the conversations that I've had with undergraduate students and with our high school students and with our middle school babies who are trying to remain motivated and engaged in the educational process through all of this change. I think about the families and some of the parents that I have had conversations with who we've been in tears together about like how the world has kind of shifted and changed. And so I think it's, as we all know, it's exacerbated, things that were already issues and problems. And as I think about like how we're thinking about, for instance, supporting our families. And this is just, coming from me also as a mom who's had to like navigate the changes for my own children is like, how can I find resources and information and support for our, not just our kids, but our parents, such that they can continue to feel good about giving their children the best that they can as things change. And so for me, it's been like more of the social, emotional, mental health, like how do we take care of not just the economic piece, because I know that's important, but I also think that there are some folks who are kind of struggling in other areas that need focus and resource such that they can continue to contribute and support their families as we move into whatever this is going to look like afterwards. So slightly different perspective, just sort of like on the softer side of like, how do we continue to take care of one another as this world continues to evolve in ways kind of unexpected.
You know, I had a question, just out of curiosity. What percentage of MIT staff is working from home? Do you have any idea? Like everybody?
That's a great question. A majority of us, except for like research staff, our students are kind of on campus, but a good chunk of the campus is working remotely.
Yeah. Andy, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to say just one comment. It's troubling to find out that a group of folks are under participating on the upside. Like, that's not good. I get that. But what's really troubling is that same group of folks are outperforming on the downside. That tells me something's really wrong and not fair. And so, you know, we all knew that different groups are performing in different ways over the last 10 or 15 years through what has been a historic bull market, of which, you know, maybe 10% of the Americans really benefit from the stock market. But to then see COVID come and to see outsized performance to the downside of that same group of people, that should be, you know, I'm a slow learner, but that was my call to action, because that's telling me that it's just not the same playing field.
Exactly. Hey, we want to move now to questions from the audience. And the first question is from Janet. She would love to hear the panelists' ideas on supporting parents and children in the first 3 years of life. Families without internet are stressed and isolated in so many ways, and there's so little support for new families in our culture. So what should we be doing for families and parents?
So something that we're trying, to be honest, it's been something led by the MIT Work Life and Wellbeing Center for MIT employees. There have been a lot of great initiatives to help us know how to parent in some ways, right? Like I know what I saw from my family, which was effective, but there were definitely some opportunities. And so I personally have gotten really excited about a partnership with an organization based in Connecticut to bring education to our families and parents about, you know, just setting up their households for success as best as we all can, both, you know, now and into the future, and not being intentional about, for me, we're very intentional. We talk to our parents about what it is that they need, but also just knowing that in order for their kids to reach the sort of success that they envision for them, there may be some support and skills that they need, just education about the fields, but also just like, you know, how to have a tough conversation when your child is not giving up, you know, the devices or other things to keep your young folks motivated. We've just been spending a lot of time thinking about parent education, and that's been guided by some really great work that's happening for MIT employees. And we're thinking about how do we make that more available to more people in the community.
I mean, a simple thing that businesses could do is that they could recognize new parents tend to be younger, and they could help emphasize the fact that maybe you don't have to work all the time. You know, particularly a single parent, maybe you spend a little bit more time with your child, a little less time at work, and have work support that, and you might have a much better outcome. When I was young and I had my kids, I made choices and they weren't always the right choices, and it was always centered around getting the work done because that was the culture that I was in, and I didn't know any better. And I think that, you know, we could steer parents towards spending more time with their kids and not penalize them within the work culture.
Hey, Andy, another audience question for you. Someone asked, if you could talk a little more specifically about the role the arts can play.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's, I mean, an obvious one is the uncomfortable questions, the uncomfortable truths. You know, I remember I was having dinner with a friend and they said something about themselves and we got into an argument. It was a very difficult conversation to have around racism. And it would be far more effective through the lens of an artistic experience, a shared experience, to have a dialogue. I think the arts can provide access and build community around tough questions that we all need to have in a much more civil and constructive way. So, you know, I don't just want to turn arts into a therapy session for society. Don't get me wrong, but I think that there is a little bit of that would make a big difference.
Great. Tony, I wondered about your thoughts about what more could be done to support parents and families. You deal with families a lot, James.
Okay, so for parents and families, I think there are a number of things. One of the things that I want to give a shout out to Kari Milner and Sarah Reese are on this call right now because they have talked about this. So you know, I don't want to siphon anyone's intellectual property, but I do think, and my colleague Ty Valetti has talked about this as well. But we don't know what we have in the city. We know piecemeal, like, you know, what program does this, what program does that, and I think if you're a parent or a caregiver who's really active and and is kind of not afraid, and there are spaces where your language is celebrated enough where the community has put stuff in that particular tongue, has outreach to you in a really articulated and robust way, you feel welcome to be a part of the tent. I mean, I think if you put the YPP under one room, if you put the Arts Center, a number of organizations under one particular space, outside, we have these tents, we have beautiful space, and have folks go shopping from tent to tent to tent and understand what are some of the nuances. And then secondly, from that, have another tent or several tents where it says, okay, my young person, we just learned about 15 different programs. These are the times in which they work. These are some of the things that, you know, that they stress. How can I fit this into my particular schedule to make sure that my young person and our family has some opportunities to learn both in the short and long term? And then we have organizations like the Cambridge Family of Colors who could be working simultaneously as the young people are in these programs throughout the course of the particular day, but being really intentional around, instead of saying we have a bunch of resources in Cambridge, which we do, but I think we have to acknowledge the fact that we may be resource rich, but we're coordinated very poorly. And so when you have those things working simultaneously, you know, it's a recipe for disaster. And so I think if we acknowledge the fact that there's a myriad of opportunities in this city, but also acknowledge the fact that in terms of until we evaluate, and I know that's a kind of a pejorative in this particular city, you know, until you evaluate how effective our coordination is, then we're not going to do a great job. And I think we also lastly need to acknowledge the fact that in watching the school committee meeting last night, and they're doing yeoman's work, and I want to respect and acknowledge what they're doing. I know there's another meeting tonight headed up by Councilor McGovern. Well, we have to stop saying to ourselves silently in our own spaces where if a kid goes off to 9th grade, we don't have to put together a program and a profile to support them throughout this. And as the report had acknowledges 3rd grade reading scores, but we also would know that the fact that in terms of if the majority of folks who have these particular degrees are not Cambridge-born folks, there are folks who have come to Cambridge to study and to live. And so we have to put together a robust plan where we're supporting our young people from birth to 25 in an articulated fashion. And so those are just some of my thoughts.
Thanks. Hey, we're getting some questions about the digital divide in Cambridge. Should Cambridge provide free citywide internet access to address this issue? What do we think?
We have to be smart about it. I don't think we should just kind of, what does that look like? How are we working with our cable providers? I mean, I think we should acknowledge who are most vulnerable. I worked on a project about 15 years ago with the Department of Commerce and primarily in the Coney Island section of New York City. And we worked pretty much with the Surf Garden housing development. And it was an opportunity where I was able to meet folks from this particular community and to not only get a needs assessment on the internet and access to broadband, because at that particular time we were seeing more students who have in some ways disengaged from the so they were a little 18 to 22, and so we had to do more what we call now distance learning. And so it was an opportunity to get a needs assessment on the technology needs of that particular community. I don't know that the dollars and cents, I'll leave that to folks, and also the data around that, I'll leave that to Mr. Williams and others. But I think in terms of just throwing out broadband without a plan is not a smart idea, but acknowledging the fact that we do have a digital divide is really important, and going to our most vulnerable folks first, I think is the smartest thing to do. Giving me Wi-Fi is not what you want to do, but maybe giving someone who needs it a little bit more and acknowledging that their speed, that they can't afford the speed that they particularly need is something I believe is more prudent.
Yeah, and I think just to Tony's point, I think the idea of identifying those most vulnerable families and figuring out what their needs are, right? I mean, I assume that, broadband is a gap for many people, but also, kids whose families are essential workers and they don't have anyone to support them in the house, whether sitting in front of a Zoom call for 8 hours a day, like that might not just be a broadband issue, but a deeper issue. So I think, being thoughtful and smart about all these different things and really understanding, the needs, again, of those who are most vulnerable, understanding their perspective on it, I think is very important.
We have a question from Suzanne about housing and the high cost of housing in Cambridge. Part one is, how do we get companies and universities to come up with area housing plans, and what's done in San Francisco? And just more broadly, how does the city slow down gentrification and the ongoing loss of rental units due to luxury housing?
Maybe just briefly here. So my background is in housing. I was an affordable housing lawyer, and then I worked on economic development and housing policy in my hometown of Detroit. And, this probably is a boring response from the research guy, but I think being data driven and really critical about how we approach these issues is very important. So one, I think, especially when there are obstacles to building new housing, I think sometimes kind of not just focusing on the units we're building, but on the impact those units can have. And I think there's a very compelling story in a place like Cambridge when, again, it's a place that actually does provide real opportunity for its residents, but residents can't take advantage of it if they can't afford to live in the community. So I think, really pushing on how we create housing that accommodates more people, especially those folks who will benefit as much as possible from a place like Cambridge. And I think, those issues around gentrification, I think, can sometimes be tricky, because I think, there's sometimes an interest in not building new housing to preserve kind of the current state of the community, but not building is not going to create more opportunities for residents as well. So I think there's oftentimes a tricky balance between building new housing, both low-income housing, mixed-income housing, market rate housing, but not wanting to push folks out. And I think understanding that balance is one that can become very politicized, but I think really kind of trying to at least stick to the data and how do we create more housing for all is really important. Again, not an easy thing to balance and solve, but I think really being thoughtful about how we do it and trying to kind of stay fact-based and not politicized, I think can be very helpful.
Can I just ask one question? It's actually less of a comment, more of a question. I want to know, to the electeds on this call, can they make the information, those university city agreements, public? So I know part of the question was around what can the universities do? Do we know what the universities have promised in working with the city of Cambridge? I think there's a lot, sometimes I know I operate sometimes in assumptions on what one should do, but I'd be curious in terms of what does that university city agreement look like? In addition to that, what do the corporations in the city agreements look like? And I think when we have an idea of what those look like, we can begin to ask some of those other questions. But that's just, I would hope that our city officials can make that information public, so that we're not just rife for these anecdotals and kind of hopes that,
Okay, I hope they'll find a way to do that. Time is running out, but I want to throw out one last question for the panel, and in any order you want to answer it. If there's one thing Cambridge could do to begin to address inequity and inequality, one thing you'd like to see happen, what would it be?
Why don't I just jump in and come from my limited perspective of innovation and enterprise creation, making capital, startup capital available for folks that don't have access to capital, that live in Cambridge, and maybe tying them up with some mentors that can help them invest that capital and create their business. I think more enterprise creation that way, it would make a big difference.
I would build on what Andy just mentioned. The great poet Nasir Jones is actually partnering with Ben Horowitz, and they're working with a phenomenal opportunity called the Queensbridge Hedge Fund. And in that hedge fund, they are providing opportunities. As my colleague Ty Belletti would often say, you know, economic empowerment is interconnected to education and access. And so when you're helping an individual from, if not one of the largest housing developments in our nation, understand economic empowerment with the intention to move into their particular home, I think that's critically important. So I think that maybe we can find a Ben Horowitz in this particular group to partner with someone from Washington Elms or Newtown Court, and we can create a hedge fund in their honor.
I'm reflecting on the narratives that we utilize to determine who is intelligent, who is creative, who has solutions to interesting problems. I think about the importance of really making sure that young folks at all ages are surrounded by individuals who encourage them, challenge them, believe in them, and are checking their bias and assumptions about what their potential can be based on circumstances and experiences. I've seen a couple of very interesting reports and videos about the experiences of young people in our Cambridge schools, talking about the conversations that they've had with teachers and guidance counselors and other adults who may be well-intentioned, but also are communicating a lower set of expectations for young folks. And so I think that has to be dispelled, that has to stop. Our young folks, you know, have such great potential, and I think we have some work to do to cultivate that and to be authentic in that cultivation and that belief. And so I think about those relationships being really critical, and how can we make sure we're optimizing those the best that we can at all levels when they have an opportunity to engage with any adult in our city.
Thank you. David, I'm going to give you the last word for our panel.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. But so I'm not sure exactly how to do it. But if we can do the work to help, I think kids especially, help build the social networks that, you know, not just doing it for the sake of building networks, but that lead towards those hedge fund relationships in 10 and 15 years down the road, that lead towards those jobs in the innovation industry, that lead towards getting a job in the trade. I think doing the hard work to figure out how we continue to build networks across lines of difference that actually lead towards upward mobility and economic opportunity, I think there's something there that can really be powerful.
Thanks so much. I'd like to thank Andy Roy, Eboney Hearn, David Williams, and Tony Clark. And I'd like to turn it back over to Lauren Marshall of the Cambridge Community Foundation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Marshall. I'm the Director of Marketing and Civic Engagement for CCF. And I'm closing out the panel this morning on behalf of the Cambridge Community Foundation. Thank you for joining us. We also want to thank Adrian Walker, our esteemed panel of experts, Eboney Hearn, Tony Clark, Andy Ori, David Williams. You've given us a lot to think about as we take our next steps with this data as a community. We want to extend a special thanks to all those who contributed through interviews, brainstorming, reviewing, thought partnerships, and in particular, the project team that resulted in the report. And this is just the beginning. It's a call to all of us to translate data to action. And as your community foundation, we are conveners. We will be partnering with organizations and groups to host conversations and invite dialogue among the city's sectors on how we can take action to address the issues discussed today. Please follow us for news and updates via email, social media, web at cambridgecf.org. And we invite those who can to join us now on a follow-on Zoom conversation where you can share your thoughts and concerns, and we can have a little bit more of a community conversation, seeing people in boxes. The link is in the chat. Thank you all for joining us, and be well.